I still remember the first time I saw Sarah as if it were yesterday. It was one of those moments where everything around you seemed to slow down, and the world narrowed in focus, drawing your attention to that person as if nothing else mattered. It was a crisp autumn day, where the air felt fresh and new, with leaves drifting down from the trees in a cascade of red and gold. I had just stepped out of a coffee shop, fumbling with my jacket and trying to balance a steaming cup in one hand and my phone in the other. That's when I saw her. She was standing across the street, wearing a simple blue dress that moved softly with the breeze. Her hair, long, auburn waves, caught the afternoon sunlight, and for a moment, I swore she glowed. There was something effortless about her, like she wasn't even aware of the attention she was drawing. Her eyes were focused on something far ahead, her face relaxed yet full of quiet intensity. I couldn't take my eyes off her. I didn't know it then, but that moment would change my life forever. I crossed the street without even realizing it, my feet moving on their own as if they had a mind independent of my body. When I got closer, I noticed she had a small, almost imperceptible smile on her lips as she glanced at her phone, and something about that subtle expression hit me right in the chest. She looked content, like she belonged there, in that exact moment. When I finally gathered the nerve to say hello, I fumbled my words, nervous in a way I hadn't felt since high school. But she laughed, not at me, but in a way that made me feel instantly at ease, as if she appreciated the clumsy charm in my awkward greeting. Her laugh was soft and melodic, the kind of laugh that makes you want to hear it again and again. We talked for what felt like hours, standing there on the busy street, and the world around us faded into a blur of colors and motion, irrelevant to the connection forming between us. That was the day everything started. The more I learned about her, the more I was drawn in. Sarah was smart and witty, with a quiet confidence that never bordered on arrogance. She could hold her own in any conversation, whether it was about art, politics, or the latest movie we'd both seen. There was a depth to her that intrigued me, something that kept me wanting to uncover more with each passing day. As the weeks turned into months, we fell in love, not in the way you see in movies where everything is dramatic and all-consuming, but in a more natural, genuine way. It was easy. Being with her felt like breathing. I didn't have to try or pretend to be anyone other than myself. She accepted me as I was, with all my flaws and quirks, and I admired everything about her. I loved the way she would crinkle her nose when she laughed, or how she absent-mindedly tucked her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. I loved the way her presence alone could make any room feel brighter and more alive. Our wedding was the culmination of everything we had shared, a day that felt like a dream from beginning to end. I still remember the way she looked walking down the aisle, radiant in her white dress, her eyes locked on mine. I was filled with an overwhelming sense of joy and disbelief that this woman, this incredible person, had chosen me. We exchanged vows under the arch of flowers, promising to love and cherish each other for the rest of our lives. I believed in those vows with every fiber of my being, believed that we were the lucky ones, that our love would stand the test of time, unshaken by the storms of life. In the early days of our marriage, everything felt perfect. We built a home together, filling it with laughter, shared moments, and quiet nights spent on the couch, wrapped in each other's warmth. Sarah and I were partners in every sense of the word. We navigated life's ups and downs side by side, always knowing that at the end of the day, we had each other to come home to. It felt like we were invincible, like nothing could ever come between us. Looking back, those were the golden years, the years when I believed that love was enough to carry us through anything. We were happy. I was happy. There were days when I would wake up and just watch her sleep beside me, her face peaceful and soft in the morning light, and I'd wonder how I had gotten so lucky. I would lie there, my heart full, thinking about our future together, about growing old with her, about the family we might one day have. I imagined a life where we would continue to share everything, the good, the bad, the mundane, and the extraordinary. For 2 decades, I lived in the certainty that Sarah and I were inseparable, that we were stronger together than apart. Those early years of our marriage were full of warmth, trust, and love. We built a life that was, by all accounts, beautiful. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our little moments of connection that only long-term couples share. We had friends who admired us, who told us how lucky we were to have found each other, and how we seemed to have it all figured out. But now, as I sit here reflecting on those times, it's hard not to feel a sharp pang of irony. I think about how perfect everything seemed, how deeply I believed in the future we were building together. It's strange to look back and realize how blind I was to the cracks forming beneath the surface, cracks that would eventually shatter everything I thought I knew. It started with little things. The kind of things that, on their own, would be easy to brush off. Misplaced items, small shifts in behavior, subtle changes in our routines. At first, I didn't think much of it. Why would I? We had been together for so long, and our relationship was solid, or so I believed. But looking back now, I can see how the seeds of doubt were planted early on, in the most mundane of moments. The first sign came when Sarah started losing things: her keys, her phone, even her favorite pair of sunglasses. She had always been so organized, the type of person who never misplaces anything. But suddenly, these small incidents became frequent. She would rush around the house, searching, her mood shifting from calm to frustrated in an instant. I remember the first time it happened. I laughed and made a joke about her finally becoming human, about how even she could be forgetful. She smiled, but it was strained, and I didn't think much of it at the time. Then there were the trips. At first, it was just the occasional night out with her friends, something that seemed completely normal. Sarah had always been social, and she cherished her time with her girlfriends. But slowly, the frequency of these outings began to increase. It was no longer just a girls' night every few weeks, it became a regular occurrence. Sometimes, she would come home late, smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers, or with her hair slightly disheveled in a way that seemed off. I tried not to let my mind wander too much. I didn't want to be that kind of husband, the paranoid, controlling one who questions every little thing. We had built a relationship on trust, after all, and I had never doubted her loyalty before. But as the weeks passed, my unease grew. I began to notice other changes too. Her phone was always with her, even when she didn't need it. She would take it into the bathroom, and keep it on silent during dinner, and I often saw her texting late at night, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. When I asked who she was talking to, she would brush it off with a casual, "Just the girls," or "work stuff, nothing important." But something about the way she said it didn't feel right. Then there were her moods. Sarah, who had always been open and affectionate, started pulling away. Small, intimate gestures that once seemed effortless between us, holding hands, a kiss on the cheek, a playful touch, became rare. She seemed distracted, distant, as if her mind was somewhere else even when we were together. Conversations became shorter and more surface level, and I found myself struggling to connect with her the way we used to. It's hard to explain the feeling that comes with the first seeds of suspicion. It's not an immediate, blinding realization, rather, it's a slow, creeping sense of something being not quite right. At night, I would lie awake next to her, listening to the sound of her breathing, wondering if I was overreacting, if I was imagining things. I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that this was just a rough patch, something every long-term couple goes through. But deep down, a nagging voice kept whispering to me that something was wrong. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that I was being ridiculous, that Sarah loved me and would never betray my trust. But as the weeks turned into months, that voice grew louder. Every time she went on another trip with the girls, every time she came home late with a vague explanation, every time she turned away from me in bed, that voice became harder to silence. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, well past midnight, and Sarah had gone to bed early after yet another girls' night out. She had been unusually quiet that evening, her eyes downcast as she slipped into bed without her usual good-night kiss. I sat in the living room, the silence pressing in on me, my thoughts racing. I didn't want to believe that she was hiding something, but by then, the doubt had taken root so deeply that I couldn't shake it. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, charging, a soft glow emanating from the screen. I remember staring at it for what felt like an eternity, battling with myself. I had never been the type to snoop. In all our years together, I had trusted Sarah implicitly. But that night, something inside me snapped. The need for answers overwhelmed everything else. I had to know. My hands were shaking as I picked up her phone. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I considered putting it down and pretending I had never even thought about it. But then I unlocked the screen and opened her messages. What I found shattered me. There they were, the messages, long threads of conversation with names I didn't recognize. The words blurred before my eyes as I scrolled through, but the meaning was painfully clear. These weren't casual exchanges with friends. These were messages from men, multiple men. The words were intimate, flirtatious, full of promises and memories that had no place in a conversation with someone who was supposed to be my wife. There were details, small mentions of places she had gone, things she had done, that I had never even known about. It felt like I was reading the secret diary of a stranger. Not the woman I had loved for over 2 decades. The world around me seemed to crumble in an instant. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the weight of what I had just uncovered pressing down on me like a physical force. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, trying to reconcile the woman I knew with the person in those messages. How long had this been going on? How had I missed it? The betrayal hit me in waves, each one more intense than the last. I felt sick, my stomach churning with a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. This was my life, the life I had built with Sarah, and it was unraveling right before my eyes. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. The love we had shared, the trust I had given her so freely, it all felt meaningless in the face of this overwhelming betrayal. But amidst the storm of emotions, a strange calm settled over me. I didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't storm into the bedroom to confront her. Instead, I sat there, staring at the phone in my hand, my mind strangely clear. I realized then that there was no point in a dramatic confrontation, no point in an outburst of rage. It wouldn't change anything. What was done was done. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. Instead, a new thought began to form in my mind. If Sarah had been living a lie for so long, if she had thought she could deceive me and get away with it, then maybe it was time for her to learn what real betrayal felt like. But not tonight. No, I would wait. I would be patient. When the time was right, I would show her the consequences of her actions in a way she would never forget. In the days that followed my discovery, I didn't confront Sarah. I didn't break down in front of her, nor did I accuse her of anything. I was numb, processing the magnitude of her betrayal in silence, but beneath that numbness, a cold, calculated plan was beginning to take shape. I had been blindsided by her deceit, but I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. No, she would feel the same humiliation, the same gut-wrenching pain that she had inflicted on me, but not in the way she might expect. I spent long, sleepless nights replaying the messages I'd read, the lies she'd told, and the years of trust that she had so casually discarded. The more I thought about it, the clearer my path became. I wanted her to experience the shame of being exposed, but in a way that was subtle, sophisticated, and, most importantly, devastating. What would hurt her the most? What would cut her to the core? And then, the idea struck me. Sarah prided herself on her image, on being the perfect wife, the elegant, composed woman who everyone admired. What could be more damaging to that image than being exposed in front of the very men she had kept hidden from me? The answer was simple, but brilliant in its cruelty. I would bring them all together, her lovers, her lies, her shame, and reveal her duplicity in the most public and elegant way possible. No dramatic shouting match, no confrontations behind closed doors. Instead, I would orchestrate a scenario where Sarah would have no place to hide, and no excuses to offer. The idea came to me almost fully formed, a trip, a lavish vacation under the guise of a romantic getaway, where I would invite each of her lovers without her knowing. They would all gather in the same room, thinking they were special, thinking they were there for her, only to realize they had been pawns in her web of deceit, just as I had been. Once the seed of the idea was planted, I began to relish in the thought of how it would play out. I could see the confusion on their faces, the dawning realization, and the horror in Sarah's eyes as everything unraveled in front of her. She would be trapped, unable to lie her way out, forced to confront the wreckage of her choices. The humiliation would be swift, sharp, and undeniable. This was what I needed, not just to expose her, but to make her feel what I had felt, to make her understand the depth of the betrayal. With the plan firmly rooted in my mind, the next step was putting it into action. I spent hours researching the perfect destination, a place far enough away from home to feel like an escape, but luxurious enough that Sarah wouldn't suspect anything. I chose a high-end resort by the sea, the kind of place we had dreamed about visiting for years but never found the time. The irony of turning what should have been a paradise into a personal hell for her was almost poetic. The resort was flawless, pristine beaches, crystal clear waters, and private villas nestled among palm trees. It was a place where people came to relax, to celebrate milestones, to fall in love. But for Sarah, it would be where her lies came crashing down. I made the booking in secret, telling her that it was a surprise, something to rekindle the spark in our marriage. She had no reason to doubt me, after all, why would I suspect anything? Little did she know, the surprise wasn't for her pleasure but for her reckoning. Once the resort was secured, I turned my attention to the next phase of the plan, contacting her lovers. It wasn't difficult to track them down. After all, I had already read through their messages, piecing together their identities from the snippets of conversations Sarah had thought were hidden from me. Some of them were men she had met at work, others through social events, and a few were more casual encounters she had somehow turned into ongoing affairs. The variety of them stunned me. How had she managed to juggle all these lives without me noticing for so long? I crafted each invitation carefully, pretending to be Sarah, using her tone and style in the messages. I invited each of them to the resort, framing it as a private, intimate getaway for just the two of them. They each thought they were special, that they were the only ones being invited. None of them knew about the others, just as I hadn't known about them. I could almost picture the smug smiles on their faces as they received the invitations, thinking they were about to spend a romantic weekend with the woman they believed was theirs alone. Coordinating the logistics was tricky, but I managed to schedule their arrivals in such a way that none of them would suspect anything until it was too late. The resort was large enough that they wouldn't run into each other immediately, and I planned to stagger their check-ins so that each one would feel like they were the guest of honor. I chose the evening of our second night there for the grand reveal, a dinner, elegant and formal, where all the pieces would fall into place. As the day of departure approached, Sarah seemed genuinely excited. She didn't suspect a thing. She even thanked me for planning such a thoughtful getaway, kissing me softly and saying how much she needed this break. Her enthusiasm was almost sickening, knowing what I knew. I played along, smiling, pretending that everything was fine, while inside, I was simmering with anticipation for what was to come. In the final days before we left, I rehearsed the scenario over and over in my head, visualizing every detail of the evening. I imagined the moment when all her lovers would walk into the room, one by one, each expecting a private dinner with Sarah, only to be met with confusion as they realized they weren't alone. I pictured the look of disbelief on Sarah's face as the truth unfolded before her, as the walls of her carefully constructed life collapsed around her. There was something almost surgical in the way I approached the planning. Every detail had to be perfect, the timing, the setting, the expressions on their faces as the truth hit them all at once. I wanted it to be slow, deliberate, a moment that would stretch out for Sarah like an eternity. She had taken years to betray me, piece by piece, and I wanted her to feel every second of her fall from grace. I knew that once the moment came, there would be no turning back. The shock, the humiliation, it would be irreversible. But that was the point. This wasn't about forgiveness or redemption. This was about making sure she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. This was about ensuring that she would feel the full weight of her actions in the most public, undeniable way possible. And so, with the plan in place, I waited. The moment we arrived at the resort, I could see the joy in Sarah's eyes. She stepped out of the car, her face lighting up as the warm sea breeze greeted us, the scent of saltwater in the air. The resort was everything I had promised it would be, luxurious, serene, and the perfect setting for what she believed was a romantic escape. I could see her excitement as she took in the stunning view of the ocean, the white sand beaches stretching out before us, and the gentle sound of the waves lapping against the shore. To her, it must have seemed like paradise. Little did she know that this paradise was about to become the stage for her undoing. I had been calm during the journey, keeping up the facade of a loving husband who had planned this trip out of pure affection. I smiled when she smiled and held her hand when she reached for mine. All the while knowing that the real show was yet to begin. Inside, I was a storm of emotions, anticipation, anger, satisfaction. But I kept it all hidden beneath a mask of tranquility. I had waited so long for this moment, and now it was finally here. I couldn't afford to let anything slip. Sarah's enthusiasm was palpable. She marveled at the beauty of the resort, pointing out the details she loved, the infinity pool overlooking the ocean, the lush greenery, the private villas tucked away among the palm trees. She looked so content, so happy, and for a moment, a small part of me felt a pang of guilt. But it was fleeting. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about justice. Sarah had spent years deceiving me, leading a double life without any regard for the pain she was causing. Now, she would face the consequences. As we settled into our villa, I couldn't help but notice the little things. The way Sarah seemed more relaxed than she had in months, the way she leaned into me, her body language open and affectionate. It was as if she believed that this trip would fix everything, that we were on the verge of rekindling whatever had faded between us. She was wrong, of course, but I let her have that moment of peace. After all, the storm was coming. Later that afternoon, as Sarah lounged by the pool, I excused myself to take a walk around the resort. In reality, I was preparing for the arrival. I had arranged everything so that her lovers would be staggered in their check-ins, each one arriving at a different time. Unaware that the others were on their way. The resort staff had been discreet, as I had requested, and everything was proceeding smoothly. The first one arrived just after lunch. I saw him before he saw me, tall, well-dressed, the kind of man who exuded confidence, someone who probably believed he was special to Sarah. He walked through the lobby with an air of self-assurance, his eyes scanning the resort as if he was looking forward to the romantic rendezvous he thought was awaiting him. I recognized him instantly from the photos Sarah had saved on her phone. He was one of her more frequent lovers, someone she had been seeing for over a year. The anger I felt when I first saw his face was visceral, but I controlled it. This wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. I watched him check in, unaware that I was observing him from a distance. The tension in the air was almost palpable, though he had no idea why. He thought he was here for a weekend of passion, for stolen moments with Sarah in this idyllic setting. But as he walked toward his villa, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of what was to come. He would be in for quite the surprise. By the time the second lover arrived, I had already slipped back into the villa to rejoin Sarah, who was still blissfully unaware. She was chatting about how perfect the trip had been so far, how we needed this time away from the pressures of everyday life. I nodded along, pretending to listen, though my thoughts were elsewhere. The second man, shorter than the first, but still well-built and undeniably handsome, entered the resort with the same air of confidence. Another one who believed he was special. He, too, checked in without a hitch, completely oblivious to the fact that he wasn't alone in his pursuit of Sarah. By the end of the afternoon, all of her lovers had arrived. I had watched them come and go, each one heading to their villa, completely unaware of the others. The tension within me was mounting with every passing hour, but I kept it bottled up. Waiting for the right moment. I could feel the weight of what was about to happen building, like a wave preparing to crash. Soon, they would all be in the same room, and everything would be revealed. As the evening approached, I suggested to Sarah that we dress up for dinner. I told her I had a special night planned, something elegant, something to celebrate us. She was delighted, completely unsuspecting. As she got ready, I went over the final details in my head, making sure everything was set. The table had been reserved, the timing had been arranged perfectly, and soon, the moment I had been waiting for would arrive. We made our way to the restaurant, Sarah looking radiant in a flowing dress, her smile wide and genuine. She had no idea that her entire world was about to come crashing down. As we walked through the resort, I felt the weight of the evening pressing down on me, but I kept my composure. I had to. This was the culmination of everything I had planned, and it had to be perfect. When we arrived at the private dining area, everything was exactly as I had envisioned it. The table was set for more than two, of course, but Sarah didn't seem to notice at first. She was too caught up in the moment, too excited about the evening to pay attention to the subtle clues. The restaurant staff, as instructed, brought out drinks, and we toasted to what she believed was the start of a romantic night. Little did she know, her lovers were already on their way. As the first one walked in, Sarah's smile faltered slightly. She glanced at him, confused for a moment, but then quickly recovered, assuming it was some kind of mistake. Maybe she thought he was just another guest, someone she didn't know. But then the second one entered, and I saw the realization begin to dawn on her face. Her eyes flicked between the two men, confusion giving way to a growing sense of panic. By the time the third one arrived, the tension in the air was unbearable. Sarah's smile had disappeared completely, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. The men, too, were starting to understand what was happening. They exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from confusion to anger as they realized they weren't here for a private rendezvous. They were here for something much darker, something they hadn't anticipated. I sat back in my chair, watching it all unfold, feeling the weight of my revenge settle in. This was what I had been waiting for. The tension, the confusion, the dawning realization, it was all playing out exactly as I had imagined. Sarah, who had thought she could keep her secrets hidden, was now exposed in front of the very men she had betrayed me with. The air was thick with tension, and I knew that the climax of this twisted performance was about to arrive. The dinner began in a heavy, simmering silence. Sarah sat across from me, her once bright demeanor now clouded with confusion and unease. The earlier excitement in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a nervous glance that flitted from one man to the next. She was beginning to understand that something wasn't right, but she hadn't yet pieced it all together. Her smile, once effortless, now faltered. She shifted in her seat, probably trying to reassure herself that this was just some strange coincidence. The table, set for more than two, was a clue that she had missed earlier, but now it must have felt glaringly obvious. As each of her lovers took their seats around the table, the air thickened with tension. The men, too, had initially arrived with expressions of calm confidence, expecting an intimate evening. But now, as they looked at each other, each realizing that they were not the only man Sarah had been involved with, their faces began to change. Confusion turned to suspicion, and suspicion gave way to dawning realization. I watched it all quietly, feeling the weight of the moment building inside me like a slow burning fire. This was it, the culmination of months of planning, of waiting, of watching Sarah deceive me over and over again, unaware that I had already unraveled her web of lies. And now, here we all were, sitting at a table that felt more like a stage for Sarah's final act. The waiters moved in and out of the room, serving the first course, but no one touched their food. There was too much tension in the air for that. The only sound was the occasional clink of silverware or the rustle of napkins as someone adjusted in their seat. Sarah's eyes darted between me and the men, her brows furrowing deeper with each passing second. She tried to make small talk, but her voice sounded strained and forced. I didn't respond, only nodding occasionally, letting her squirm in the growing discomfort. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I decided it was time. Time to set the final piece of my plan in motion. I raised my glass, the soft clink of the crystal cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife. Everyone turned to look at me, Sarah, the men, the waitstaff. All eyes were on me, but I was focused solely on her. To Sarah, I began, my voice calm, almost gentle, though the words were laced with cold, calculated malice. To the best actress I've ever known. The room went still. There was a brief moment of silence as my words hung in the air, their meaning not yet fully sinking in. Sarah blinked, her confusion deepening. I saw her glance around the table again, searching for answers, but finding only the same perplexed faces staring back at her. I held her gaze as I continued, lifting my glass slightly higher. Here's to her finest performance yet, a role she's played for years without anyone ever suspecting a thing. The role of the perfect wife. I could feel the shift in the room, the subtle change in the energy as the men began to understand what I was implying. Their faces, once merely puzzled, now showed the first signs of anger and betrayal. They had come here expecting a romantic evening with the woman they thought was theirs. Instead, they were part of a cruel, elaborate revelation. Sarah, though, was still catching up. She forced a shaky laugh as if trying to turn my toast into a joke, but I could see the fear starting to creep into her eyes. She looked at me, searching for some kind of reassurance, but I gave her none. My smile was cold, my eyes unflinching. The toast continued as the men, one by one, hesitantly raised their glasses. They didn't know what else to do, their expressions a mix of confusion and indignation. The awkward clink of glasses echoed through the room, a strange and disjointed sound, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. And then it happened, the moment I had been waiting for. As the words left my mouth, her finest performance, a heavy silence descended over the table. The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with anticipation. I could feel every heartbeat, every shallow breath, as everyone tried to process what had just been said. Sarah's face, usually so composed and graceful, began to change. I saw the shift in her eyes first, a flicker of realization, a crack in her carefully constructed mask. It was subtle at first, a slight narrowing of her eyes and a tightening around her mouth, as if she was trying to figure out if I was playing some kind of cruel joke. But as the seconds ticked by, the truth began to dawn on her. She looked at me, and then at each of the men sitting around the table. Her breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling with increasing speed as the full weight of the situation hit her. The men, too, were realizing what was happening. One of them, the first to arrive, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face darkening with a mix of anger and embarrassment. Another clenched his jaw, his fists tightening around the stem of his wine glass as if he were struggling to keep his composure. They all knew now. They weren't the only ones. They had been deceived, just like I had been. Sarah's face was a portrait of unraveling panic. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She was speechless, frozen in place as the enormity of her betrayal unfolded before her. I watched her, savoring every second of her downfall. This was what I had waited for, the moment when she would realize that her lies had caught up with her, that there was no more hiding, no more pretending. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch out, letting her squirm in it. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing in as the reality of her situation became undeniable. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. She looked at me, pleading silently for an explanation, for some kind of lifeline. But there was none. I had nothing left to give her. She had already taken everything. Finally, I spoke again, my voice calm and measured. "I suppose you're wondering why they're all here," I said, gesturing to the men around the table. "I thought it was time everyone met. After all, you've been such a good hostess to each of them, haven't you, Sarah?" Her face drained of color. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a choked sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. She looked at the men, one by one, her eyes wide with desperation, but none of them would meet her gaze. They were too busy wrestling with their anger and their sense of betrayal. The men were beginning to stir now, the full gravity of the situation sinking in. One of them, her lover of over a year, leaned forward, his voice low and cold. "Is this true?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he stared at her. Sarah's hands trembled in her lap. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The mask had fallen completely now, and all that was left was raw panic, raw fear. She looked at me, her eyes wide with terror, as if begging for mercy. But there was no mercy left in me. I watched her, taking in every twitch of her face, every flicker of panic and realization. This was the moment I had planned for, the moment when everything she had built came crashing down around her. And it was glorious. The moment of realization hit Sarah like a tidal wave. I watched it wash over her face, twisting her features into a grotesque mix of horror, disbelief, and rage. It was as if her world, this carefully constructed facade of lies and deceit, had crumbled before her eyes. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her lips quivered, and her hands, which had once been so elegant and graceful, now trembled violently in her lap. The Sarah who had always been so composed, so in control of every situation, was unraveling right in front of me. At first, she said nothing. There was just silence, the kind that feels almost deafening because it's filled with too much, too many thoughts racing through her head, too many emotions she didn't know how to handle. Her wide eyes darted between the men at the table and then back to me, desperately seeking something, an explanation, a way out, anything that would make this nightmare go away. But it wasn't going away. This was reality now, and she had no control over it. Her mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came. I could see the panic in her eyes, the sheer terror that comes when someone realizes they've lost everything in an instant. She looked at me, pleading with her gaze as if silently asking how I could do this to her. But that was the irony, how I could do this to her. She had been the one living a double life, lying to me, betraying me with these men sitting at our table. And now, with the truth exposed, she still wanted to play the victim. The first sound she made was more of a gasp than a word, her voice catching in her throat. Then came a stammering attempt at speech, her voice shaking as she struggled to find the right thing to say. "Mark, I can explain," she finally managed to choke out. Her tone high and panicked. "It's not what it looks like. You don't understand." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Not what it looks like. That's what she chose to say. Even now, when she had been caught red-handed, she was still trying to spin the narrative, still trying to manipulate the situation as if she could somehow talk her way out of this. But there was no talking her way out of this. Not this time. The men around the table exchanged glances, their faces a mix of disgust and anger. One of them, the tall, confident man who had been sitting silently, finally spoke up. His voice was cold, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Sarah. "Explain what, Sarah?" he asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty clear. You've been lying to all of us." Sarah whipped her head toward him, her expression one of desperation. "No, no, that's not true," she cried, her voice rising in pitch as she tried to claw her way out of the hole she had dug herself into. It's more complicated than that. You don't understand, But her words were falling on deaf ears. No one believed her anymore. Not them, and certainly not me. I watched as her panic morphed into anger, a fiery rage bubbling up beneath the surface. She glared at me now, her face flushing with fury. "How could you do this, Mark?" she spat, her voice sharp and venomous. "You've been planning this all along, haven't you? You're sick. This is sick." I didn't flinch. Her anger was predictable. A desperate attempt to deflect, to make me the villain in a story where she had been the one betraying everyone. I let her rant, let her fury spill out across the table because it didn't matter. Her words had no power here anymore. She could call me sick, twisted, whatever she wanted. It wouldn't change the fact that her lies had been exposed, and there was no coming back from this. The other men were silent now, watching her unravel, their faces hardening with the same realization I had already come to. She had used them, lied to them, just like she had lied to me. I could see it in their eyes, the betrayal, the humiliation. They had thought they were special to her, just as I had once thought I was special to her. But now, they knew the truth. They were nothing more than pawns in her game. Sarah's rage began to falter as she realized she was getting no sympathy, no support from anyone at the table. Her eyes darted around, wild and frantic, and I could see the fear returning, the cold, hard reality settling in. She was alone now, completely and utterly alone. No amount of pleading, no amount of excuses or deflection could save her. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. The sound seemed to echo through the room, a final punctuation to everything that had been said. Sarah froze, her eyes locked on me, her breath shallow and uneven. For a moment, I just stood there, looking down at her, taking in the sight of the woman who had once been the center of my world, now reduced to this broken, frantic shell of herself. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel anger. I felt free, lighter than I had in years. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said quietly, my voice calm, almost serene. "I'm done." And with that, I turned and walked away. Behind me, I could hear Sarah's voice, her words a frantic, incoherent mix of apologies and accusations. She was shouting at the men now, trying to explain, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of her lies. But they weren't listening. I could hear their voices rising too, sharp, angry, accusatory. The sound of chaos, of everything falling apart. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I walked out of the restaurant, the cool night air hitting me as I stepped outside, leaving the noise and the madness behind. As I made my way through the resort, I could still hear her distant shouts echoing behind me, but they were fading now, becoming nothing more than background noise. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for so long was gone. My revenge was complete, and it had been everything I needed it to be. Sarah was left to face the consequences of her actions, the mess she had made, and the people she had hurt. It was her problem now, not mine. I had played my part, and now it was over. With each step I took, the weight lifted a little more, until finally, as I left the resort behind, I felt nothing but peace.